The question is, which timeline will succeed? And the answer is always the one that has the most attention. And so this is how we change our destiny, and this is how we change the future. And then, at this point, I think it probably didn't even matter what the event was. It was a beautiful experiment to teach us, and we could apply it to anything we wanted to, and we could literally shape reality into a new direction.
Whispers in the static, secrets leave a mark. Truth ain't in the daylight, it lives after dark. Ryan's on the trail, pulling threads apart. The Ryan files after dark, this is where it starts. Angels on the skyline, demons in the mist. Giants in the earth, fists the size of cliffs. Nephilim footprints, history's abyss. Pyramids aligned, but who's making the list? Oh God, sleeping, Yahweh's thunder roars. Secrets in the scriptures, knocking on the doors. From Eden to the stars, the questions never pause. What's the cost of the truth? It's written in scars. Pages burning, lies unravel. Footsteps crunch where the ancients travel. Voices whisper where the echoes babble. Stay curious or let the shadows grab you. The ride files after dark, peeling back the veil, igniting the spark, searching through the cosmos. Truth leaves its mark. Stay curious. This is just the start.
What if the future isn't something that simply happens to us, but something that can be influenced, altered, even prevented? For years, whispers have circulated about a classified project known as Operation Looking Glass, a technology allegedly designed to peer into future timelines to see potential outcomes before they unfold. Tonight's conversation takes us deep into that claim, not from a place of sensationalism, but through the personal journey of a filmmaker and researcher who followed the trail wherever it led. My guest, Frank Jacob, has spent years examining Project Looking Glass, consciousness research, and the question of whether collective human focus can influence reality itself. This episode is not about telling you what to believe. It's about exploring ideas that sit at the intersection of classified projects, human consciousness, and the possibility that the future may not be as fixed as we've been told. This is Operation Looking Glass, through the lens of one man's journey. This is the Ryan Files. Let's dive in. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me this week on the Ryan Files. My guest today is filmmaker, researcher, and systems explorer, Frank Jacob, known for his deep dives into CERN, Project Looking Glass, advanced physics, and the hidden forces shaping human consciousness. Now, Frank's work has evolved dramatically over the years, and he's now pushing into territory where frontier science meets myth, where plasma becomes memory, and where the Earth herself might be a conscious participant in the story of humanity. Man, Frank, thank you so much for joining me this week on the Ryan Files.
Glad to be here.
So, Frank, you kind of made a name for yourself over the years in this space of Project Looking Glass, connections with CERN, and so many other things. But you've obviously kind of had an evolution, so to speak, in your way of thinking about this stuff. Just for our audience, if you don't mind, let's start at the beginning. Project Looking Glass, what it is, how you got into it, all that stuff. Tell us a little bit about yourself as well, and get this thing kicked off.
Yeah, well, sure. I guess you could say, well, the start of it, that would go back quite a while. I guess if I go back let's see, when was 2012? 13 years ago. Oh my God, that long. Okay, I started with a film. Well, I didn't start with this film, but the first film that kind of went out in collaboration with my filmmaking partner, Tanya Maidenford of Screen Addiction, went out in 2012, and that was called Solar Revolution. And that film was sort of venturing into territory that most people would call frontier science. We were talking about the pineal gland and the effects the cosmos was having, that there's an increase of registered energy in the local area of our solar system. And we were working together with a biophysicist who's fairly well known. He's a bestseller over here in Germany, to translate his book material into film. And that's what that film became. And that film sort of went out there, actually won some awards, and it's still kind of making waves because it was kind of cutting edge. There's not a lot of material out there that, covers these areas in a fairly disciplined and ethically, beautiful or whatever. We just tried to make something a little bit more cinematic and a little bit more, easy on the eyes, if you will.
Right.
Starting with that project, because there's so many. I was working at the time I was doing that. I was working for a media house in Austria that many people know the brand. It's called Red Bull. So I was doing a lot of the material that people call sport porn. These crazy stunts where athletes do crazy stuff, and I was always trying to get them to do some of the more avant-garde subjects, but they just weren't budging. So my first solo venture to become a full-length feature maker was this film up there that you see. That one was called Packing from Mars, and that took about 5 years to make. So about during that time, Solar Revolution was released. I worked on another one with Tanya about out of place artifacts with a man called Klaus Dona. And Packing from Mars, though, was kind of like the punk brother, of those two films, or at least of Solar Revolution, because it was also broaching into areas of frontier science, but it was based on a book that had been put into contact with, or, maybe a decade earlier, a sort of controversial, crazy sci-fi novel called Alternative 3. And Alternative 3 is something that, if people do the research, they find out it's about a Mars colony or a supposed Mars colony, a breakaway civilization. And when I was deciding on what subject to embark on this journey of cinematic documentary feature-length films, I stumbled into an interview with some, yeah, I guess you could say fairly surprising names. One of them was Laura Eisenhower, another was Andrew Basiago, and then there was like Andrew Lambermont Weber, and these people were sort of, in this territory. So I reached out to them, and that kind of got me started. And I basically threw a film studio in a suitcase, hit the road, and looked for the story. And it was during the course of making that film that I got to know fairly closely or intimately people such as Bill Ryan, who many people will know as, him and Carrie Cassidy were kind of the founders of the Project Camelot. And I interviewed them both, and Bill reached out to me after I left California, and he wanted to continue working together. So we got to know each other fairly well, and it was through a combination of his information about Looking Glass, because he had some of that information. He was telling me I should maybe incorporate it, but I wasn't really seeing it in terms of how it fit into the Mars subject. And Tanya Maidenford as well had information on Looking Glass, so I kind of knew of the material out there. But I didn't do anything with it. I just kind of stashed all the archive material. And then, as we know, there was this guy called Bill Wood who was doing this. Who did an interview on Project Camelot, who said he was a strings theory and mathematician expert who was brought in to help the people that were running Project Looking Glass to fix a problem that they had. And that problem was that in 2012, well, if I could explain a little bit about Looking Glass being a tech, it sort of describes it in the name. It's a looking glass. It allows you to look at, in this case, timelines. And the people that were running that project were having problems in terms of they were trying to see, into the future. And whenever they got up to 2012, it seemed like everything kind of fuzzed out or went white. And there was a lot of reporting going on about it at the time, and many people were covering it, the usual people that we all knew, big names in the disclosure field. And then 2012 came and went, and of course, as we know, the big, shift that everybody was expecting didn't materialize, and it all went quiet. And then well, then along came, the COVIDiot era, and right at the start of that. There was I was doing some research on a totally non-related subject. I was following the work of another researcher and a blog character guy who was doing video blogs, and I was sort of searching down his Telegram channel, and I saw this weird obscure message that said Guardians of the Looking Glass. And I hadn't heard that word now in my, I haven't been using that word now for probably close to a decade. And then I'm suddenly thinking to myself, what? Project Looking Glass? What does that have to do with this guy, right? So I couldn't help. I clicked on it, and I ended up on a YouTube channel with, I think it had been set up days earlier. There's nothing going on. It was, there were like 20, 30 clicks. There were a couple of videos up, and they were very provocative. They were talking about events that were about to happen, what is Looking Glass, and what they were. And they were calling themselves the guardians of the Looking Glass because they claimed to be part of the original Looking Glass team that went sort of like that felt because of what they had seen and because of what had really been seen, having not actually been published, but kind of was obfuscated, they were part of the team that couldn't, in good conscience, sit on this data because they said it was so cataclysmic and so earth-changing that they needed a way to leak it out there so that the people could protect or prepare themselves for what was about to come. And I thought, I looked at the data and I read, their text, and I thought, it's the thing I liked about it that stood out immediately for me was that, we had done this film Solar Revolution, and we were talking about cosmic radiation and the change that was about to happen on the planet due to the cosmic influence. And part of what these guys were talking about in their video coincided one to one with that. And I'm thinking, not too many people know that information. This is like, not the kind of stuff that everybody sits there around the coffee table or a kitchen table talking about. So that alone kind of made it stand out to me. So I decided to look at it a bit closer. And in the end, we can get into some more of the details, but in the end, what they were saying is, look, we're the only way we can get this information out there is for a lot of people to watch these videos. So if you really want to help, then do something. And I'm like, okay, well, what could I do, right? So I have a small, modest following, on the internet, and I know some good people, and I have a publisher friend in Germany that I know. So I decided to write a story. And that story got translated into German, or I wrote it in German, or I can't remember, something like that. And I put it out there on this fairly large blog in Germany. That blog happened to be something that I guess probably like the better part of a few 100,000 people go through it every day. And one of those people was a person in the United States who had his own channel. And that was a guy called John Nolan. He had a channel called The Inspired Channel. And he saw my article and he had actually just put out a video, I think, with Bill Wood in it. So he was very curious about this and he reached out to me and he had me on his show. And we began talking about these Guardians of the Looking Glass. And we began to follow it because they started dropping more videos. And so I would analytically break the videos down in terms of technical feasibility, what I knew about it relative to some of the fringe science, frontier science stuff that I was working on, if it fit, what other things were related to it. And I opened my mouth and said I should, maybe do a webinar about this because I have so much information in my archives. And I was hit by hundreds of people saying, yeah, do this webinar. I want to be part of it. So that kind of forced me to act on what I've said. So I put together this webinar. This is a few years after releasing our Packing for Mars film. So I get 5 or 7 years or something later. So I'd never really done anything in that kind of a webinar format, except I'd done actually productions for others, bigger names that were doing webinars, and I produced their webinars for them. And I'm like, I can do this. This is easy. So I took that information and I put together a webinar. It's a lot easier than making a cinematic film. And I put it out there, and the thing exploded. And not only that, but the shows, John kept having me back on Inspired, and we kept, talking about it, and hundreds of thousands of people. By the time this one proclaimed event was about to happen, the date was April 18th, if I'm not mistaken, we had amassed, I think, several million people watching what was going on. And the message was simple, like, look, if this is really going on, and the way to avert it is to talk about it and to, try to spoil the plans of those who are trying to do it covertly, then why not? What is it harmed? What is it harmed in us talking about it? If we look at it as a social consciousness experiment and not focus on the doom and gloom end of the world scenario, which a lot of people, other people were doing, but looking at it purely from the level of consciousness, because that's kind of my main interest, that's what we did, and it seemed to work. And so we actually took claim, or we believe that as a result of all those people watching, we actually averted what was supposed to happen on April 18th. And subsequently, the Guardians of the Looking Glass released a video right after that, which essentially substantiated that we had done that. So that kind of launched that whole Looking Glass scenario into the orbit.
Wow. It's dropped a lot of information there. I got questions already.
Go
Okay,
for
so
it.
basically we're looking at, Project Looking Glass, just a the cursory definition is the ability somehow, some way, is technology to look into the future, possible outcomes, which obviously is a major tool. If you had the ability to look into the future, see different options and things that could transpire, well, that could be a very valuable tool. So that's what we're talking about. But what you're talking about, and it's interesting, man, Frank, again and again and again, I get PhDs, scientists, doctors, all kinds of people on here. They're all starting to talk about consciousness and how it's connected to things. So this is going to be fascinating. But you're basically saying that through your work on April, what was it, April 18th? And can you describe kind of what that was, what was
Well,
supposed
they
to
were
happen?
saying that these people that were running the Project Looking Glass were trying to trigger events which would bring in a timeline that they had seen in the Looking Glass, which would work in their favor. Which timeline, of course, led, and all the buzzwords were in those messages. 2030, this event coming from the cosmos that would shift consciousness. They were talking about vaccines in terms of technology, which had a chance to shut off the functionality which this cosmic energy from the center of the universe, or from our galaxy, was actually going to trigger in humans. And it was interesting because at that point, like this is like I think the beginning of 20 was like 2022, and we hadn't really experienced the vaxes yet. Nobody knew about some of the crazier stuff that we've now since exposed, like the graphene oxide element of it, these weird clots that people are getting, the nanotechnology which forms into sort of crystalline shaped things that look like microchips and that could be in our bodies, which could communicate with in and out, from within and from without of our bodies. If that, all this stuff was unknown. So they were kind of really on the cutting edge with this information. This is why I took it seriously, because it's like, who would really know that stuff, or why would they put this stuff out there? And so they were saying that on the 18th, they were going to trigger something via a dirty nuke in Times Square, which was going to kill 3,500 to 5,000 Americans on the spot. And then they were going to blame Russia, and it was going to escalate into some kind of a warfare with Russia and proxies that the Americans had in the area of which was the Ukraine. So here we are, right? What was happening exactly at that point? Well, we had the Russians invading the Ukraine. We had the whole escalation of the Ukrainian Zelensky dialogue. The narrative began to form and push in the direction of a war, inevitable war, and all this other stuff. So all this stuff was running in the background, and it was parallel to this narrative that was being described in the Looking Glass material.
Awesome. So we're basically talking about a timeline that could have happened. Everything you just described is this timeline that some people were pushing for that could have happened, but it was averted. And you said part of that aversion was just by you and people that you were working with, basically getting the word out there, increasing the consciousness of this possibility. And that is what you're saying averted that particular timeline that the Looking Glass people were shooting for, or the bad guys were shooting for, or whatever. That's if that's what you're saying, then we've got a very interesting thing going on. I mean, um,
Absolutely.
whenever, and there's so many people that talk about, you get a group of people all thinking the same way, putting their energy into something in the same direction, all rowing in the same direction, basically, that it has a bigger power than just, you know, simple thoughts or hopes or dreams. There's a reality to what goes on there. Explain that.
Well, you could look at it as kind of a beta test. Whether we averted it or not, I would say if we averted it and we had like, how do I prove it? Well, it's hard to prove something like that. Okay, let's just be honest. But what we did bring in is we had actually world-class remote viewers which we brought in. And the proper way to deploy remote viewers, people that are familiar with the subject, is to not give them a target name. Don't tell them exactly, oh, look at Times Square on April 18th. And it begins to, it puts a charge on it that intermingles with the cultural with the cultural field, and we can get into that a little down the line. But basically, the best way to use a remote viewer is to give them a number, just something random and has nothing to do with what they're looking at. And so we actually deployed some remote viewers who at first weren't even going to participate because they just thought this is nuts. There's no way. This is a hoax. It's clickbait, whatever, But eventually, what happened is some of the more curious decided to take us up on, targets that we had identified that we didn't tell them about. We just said in and around, this date, and we gave them these targets, and they began to see stuff that actually correlated to what was being described in the Guardians of the Looking Glass videos. And so one of the things that was released at the time of the April 18th event was a confirmation email from one of our remote viewers that said, we saw it. We saw that it happened at 2 p.m. There was a van. The van had a bomb, and the people knew about it. They intercepted the van, and they averted the thing. But don't tell anybody who you got this information for. We don't want any black limousines showing up in front of our door. So essentially to that effect. So that was one interesting confirmation. The other interesting thing was that it really has been proven that when you have kind of mass consciousness focusing on things, and this has been in many ways in meditation experiments that they've done, that you can actually shift the field. You can shift what is happening in reality by putting this focus, because we are electromagnetic beings. And when we put our brains have electromagnetic charge. Our heart throws a 4 meter radius electromagnetic field from our bodies. It goes in, it penetrates the electromagnetic field around us, and collectively we actually accumulate electromagnetic charge in the environment, because literally we're living in an electrical magnetic environment. Right now, where you're sitting, there's 100 volts around you of electromagnetic charge. You don't feel it because you're accustomed to it. You're built for it. Your body's chemistry and biology and all the hardware in you is tailored to work within a certain voltage frequency band, which is optimized for us, for humans. And so we've proven that we actually can affect things through our, physical emanation, through our mental emanation. And then there's something about quality of thoughts that comes into it as well. And so this is one of the reasons that I really wanted to, Ryan, put it into the context of a consciousness experiment and focus on that rather than focusing on the doom and gloom scenario, because I figured, look, if it's going to happen. It's going to happen anyway. So, why focus on that part of it? Let's just focus on the positive part of it, that we actually have these amazing bodies that can actually generate fields and enter information into the field. Now, since that time, I've learned a lot more about that. Right. So what I identified back then, and even the Looking Glass Guardians people as future timelines, I see it a little differently now. I see it more in terms of field and memory that is like real, like just present at all moments. And that what some people might mistake as future or past events is just them reading what's in that field. And that field is happening now. It's not happening in the future. There is no future. There's only really just now. And the thing about the now that's really interesting is that we have been filling that field of what's in the now since the very first time any creature had any sensory experience on this planet, from insects, to amoebas, to humans, to birds, whatever. All of us, we have senses, we have sensory experience, and it's a two-way thing. We take in information and we reflect that information back into the field. This is what they call phylogenetic memory. And so this is where consciousness works into it. We actually have this two-way communication. You don't come into the world with nothing. When you were born, you already had certain instincts. You had some people even say they have certain talents. Some people are brilliant musicians or brilliant mathematicians or, whatever. They have skills that they really can't explain at a very early age. Why? Well, because they're somehow able to draw this information out of the field and assimilate it into their bodies. That's kind of how this works. So if you want, you can jump in with any other questions at this point.
Well, just a couple things. You did mention remote viewing, and for those that aren't familiar with that, it's a concept, a technique that has been used for decades. In certainly in the United States military, there's all kinds of CIA declassified documents about it. There's movies about it, but it's a real thing, man. It's a real thing. Crazy as it sounds, and for these things like remote viewing, for what you said, tapping into this field and whatnot. All of a sudden, Frank, it's like we're not in Kansas anymore. There's
Yeah, yeah.
there's more to our reality than just going through the day and the chores and punching the clock and getting home and buying a Christmas gift and or whatever. There's a lot more going on that I think I appreciate people like you who are diving into it, but the majority of humanity, it seems like, just they're not connected to it. They don't get it. Um, but when you start realizing that, hey, this is a reality, man, that should almost change the way you live your life, right? Because you're connected to something far bigger than just you or just humanity, even.
Right. And I think what I've come to identify is there's two ways of looking at that. And the way that I was looking at it maybe 10 years or 5 years ago, or even in that area, I was, I was hanging around a lot of sort of theoretical physics type people. And they were embracing a lot of the quantum, physics metaphors. And they were talking about simulation, and they were talking about, theoretical physics models, and they were talking about things as an advanced form of what has become known as particle physics. Essentially, the Einsteinian model, there was a Big Bang, and gravitation rules the universe, and that all these objects we see spinning out there essentially are attracted and repelled from each other with the force of gravity, and that everything out there in the universe is dead. It's just literally dead matter. And the only reason that we are around is that through some fluke of coincidence, enough particles and rocks slammed together to create consciousness. And here we are, right? So, but they struggle with explaining that, of course, because it is kind of ridiculous. And, Lemaitre, who was the physics mathematician who was in the Vatican, who was the, part of the Holy, Trinity, whatever, was the person who actually coined that term and invented it. And it's funny that physicists who believe in everything, in nothing, and that everything is dead, actually would embrace a theory that was invented in the clergy. And the clergy invented it because they were trying to bridge the emerging quantum physics language and these Einsteinian science models with, their outdated and quickly, migrating population that was moving away from belief in religion to belief in scientism, right? So that's part of why that happened, you could say. But literally, they've never to this date been able to really explain any of it properly. It's all just theoretical, all of it. So there's that dead model, the dead particle model, the coincidence model. But there's another model, and that model that is something that many people are in the new age scene or whatever often embrace without even knowing it, is the idea of the consciousness model, that everything is conscious and that the universe is conscious. Well, how do you explain that? Well, it turns out that about 100 years there was a science that was emerging that was literally explaining these things to us in form of ether. And they were talking about an etheric field. They were talking about plasma. There were names like Dmitri Mendeleev, who was the first person to invent a periodic table. But his periodic table, incidentally, had something he called element X, which was the fundamental substance underneath all the elements in his table, which was then deleted 100 years ago. And then you had people like Irving Langmuir, who invented the term plasma. Why? Well, because plasma acts in a laboratory setting similar to the way plasma, which our blood is a liquid which carries all the other blood cells within it, which is allowing the interaction between blood cells and all that and that charge to happen in our bodies. Well, he saw the parallels to it in the electromagnetic world, and that's why he called ether plasma. So you have plasma in this etheric model, and there were people like Hannes Alfvén, who were actually could be considered the grandfather of plasma physics. There was a guy called Birkeland who figured out that we are connected to the sun via these giant electric strands, these currents, which he called Birkeland currents. And so it turns out that there was a model that was actually growing and gaining in popularity at about 100 years ago, which also incidentally Nikola Tesla was making use of. And some of his experiments with the ionosphere and electricity and wireless things like that, that was telling us, no, the universe isn't empty. It's not a vacuum. The universe actually is filled to the brim. It's just filled with a substance we have yet to identify in modern physics. And that is now turning out to be what a new kind of physics we're calling, or actually an old new kind of physics called plasma physics. So there's a plasma cosmology. And the plasma cosmology is connected to another thing called electric universe, which you may have heard whispered around a little bit. Most people think it's some crazy theory, but I've actually tried to break that all down and explain it in my last project that I released, the Ancient X-Files and the Plasma Matrix. So we could get to that a bit later. But what's interesting is that you have a model that actually tells us that it's alive. How do they know that? Well, there's a guy called Vadim Tsitovich who did an experiment in Russia that he had plasma in his lab in little amounts, and he found out that if you keep them in an environment with a charge, that these plasmas actually begin to act like they're conscious. They begin to react to the environment around them, like they're some weird, living, primitive, amoeba-like entity. And in fact, if you keep the charge going long enough, what happens is that, and the key word here is, I guess, a type of plasma that he was working with called complex dusty or dusty complex plasma. You see, there's actually four kinds of plasma, but we wouldn't have to go into all of that right now. But dusty complex plasma is the one that matters. It's the one that actually we utilize, that our bodies are comprised of, and that everything you see out there when you look out into the telescopes, into the stars at night, that is dusty plasma. It's this glowing plasma that you see that most people call gas, but it's actually charged particles, ions and electrons, and they're living in this like super electrically charged sea, if you will, like a giant ocean, if you want. And the ocean has currents, like our ocean has currents. You know, we have these currents running in the oceans, we have currents running in the skies. Well, the space has these currents running in the huge electromagnetic spectrum, and they were identified by Birkeland. That's why they call them Birkeland currents. And they connect everything. So if you extrapolate from the little experiment that Vadim Tsitovich did in his laboratory with conscious plasma, and you expand that to plasma the size of the center of our galaxy, well, if plasma in the lab is conscious to some primitive extent, then it's not a far, thought to think that extrapolate that to something the size of the center of our galaxy being super consciousness sitting right there in the center of our galaxy. So that's kind of those two different models explained in a nutshell.
Yeah, I've run into this. The old Einsteinian physics, particle physics, versus like you said, the old but new, and Tesla was definitely into it. And I forget the exact term, but I've talked to a number of people who are tapping into that same thing, just from a scientific level, really. A lot of answers to all this physics stuff and people trying to understand consciousness from a scientific level. You can't do it with Einsteinian physics. You can't do it with
Right.
particle physics.
Right.
And
Yeah.
that's kind of that's the gatekeeper, so to speak, because you can't get through the gate with that kind of thinking. It doesn't click. So you come up with this, where you're getting into electromagnetism, wave theory versus particle theory and whatnot. But ultimately, and there's a lot of people who are just like, okay, whatever, it's cool, I'm fine with whatever. I don't really care to understand exactly what that means. But on the other side of that coin is the fact that what we're talking about is tapping into something that we are uniquely designed, it feels like, to be able to tap into. And there's a conscious choice there of like, okay, if I can tap into this thing, what is it? What does that mean? And wouldn't that probably make me a better human being or whatever? That's kind of what it feels like, right?
Right. And that's, I think, where I was leading when I broke it down into those two polarities. And I haven't gotten to that part yet. And that actually ties directly to what you're talking about. For me, the next building block in my own personal journey was the discovery of Gnosticism. And when I made that discovery, and not just any Gnosticism, a lot of people have, like anything, you realize that you can't just use the word, like it's like saying I discovered physics. Like, well, okay, it's like a broad field, right? Well, there's some people that believe in plasma physics, and there's people that believe in particle physics. Those are two diversely opposed forms of physics. They're just talking about a scientific method. Well, Gnosticism is a little bit like that. There's actually a pop Gnosticism out there, which I've termed that way because when I began to kind of deep dive into the sources of Gnosticism, I realized that the pop Gnostic version is the version that kind of leans on the early church fathers' narratives that, we're like we're on this planet, that, we're sinners, and we have to, discover that we have this spark of divinity in us, and then we have to eventually rise above all this, and then we can rise into higher dimensions of consciousness and eventually escape, right? And that, that version of Gnosticism, actually, it turns out, is not the true Gnostic message. The true Gnostics, and there's a word for that kind of Gnosticism, and it's called Valentinian Gnosticism, because of this guy called Valentinus. And he was, you could say, an early or late Gnostic, I guess, in terms of the evolution of the Gnostics. But he was living at the time when the church fathers had banned Gnosticism, when the Gnostics began coming forward and debating with the early Christians to discount their theory of a redeemer, of a father God outside of the planet. And they were just because they had, really literally set up mystery schools for thousands, really by this time, thousands of years, they'd set up libraries and they'd collected vast archives of information. They were like the cutting edge of consciousness at the time. And that was kind of speaking out against the church fathers who wanted us to believe in something and not know something, which is why they ended up calling the Gnostics, which is a word that is a sort of a smart, it's like saying smartass. It was a derogatory term. Actually, they themselves called themselves the telestai, those who are aimed. And they were aiming for the truth. They were aiming for true knowledge. And they came up and debated against these Christians. And the Christians, literally, because they were backed by eventually the Romans and the Roman army, they were annihilated and they became kind of banned and ostracized, and their libraries were destroyed, such as the Library of Alexandria. Their, prime, information was literally eradicated. And guys like Valentinus, they saw it as an advantage to kind of embrace the Christian ideology and morph some of the Gnostic messaging into that ideology, as you could say, as a way of self-preservation, if anything. Maybe they thought there's some way that we can slide the Gnostic information into the Christian information, into the Judeo-Christian Abrahamic religions. Then maybe at some point in the future, or whatever, I don't know what they were thinking. But the fact is, unfortunately, what they ended up doing is contaminating the Gnostic message from what its true message was. And that message was based on another form of Gnosticism, which is called Sethian Gnosticism, because the descendants of the Telestai, or the ancestors of the Telestai, were the Sethians, the lineage of Seth, right? If you go into the biblical lore, right, and the very beginning, right, the sons, right, Cain and Abel, well, there was Seth, and Seth was a specific branch of Gnosticism, which literally was one that was bound to the earth, that saw the earth as a living being, and that actually communicated directly with that living being, and they gave it a name. The name they gave that being was Sophia, or Sophia, which in Greece means wisdom. And they called her the wisdom goddess. And they began a dialogue through shamanic interaction. You could call them intellectual shamans that lived really, I think, if you go back to like one of the leading scholars in this, I should mention his name is John Lamb Lash. And he put out a book called Not in His Image, which I highly recommend you reading it. And it's a way to kind of get you off the wrong form of pop Gnosticism, more to the traditional, the real sources of the information. Because the real source of the information that we know about them kind of emerged in 1945 with the discovery of the Nag Hammadi codices. What that tells us is that there was this group that literally had this direct interaction of cosmic communication with the planetary animal mother, the entity which they called the living earth. And there's a story behind that. There's a whole creation narrative behind how Sophia came to be the Earth. And that ties directly into plasma cosmology, Ryan. It's crazy, right? Those guys, thousands of years ago, maybe didn't have the terminology that we have, but what they were describing is exactly what we see happening out there, and what we're beginning to understand is alive and going on in the cosmos, that the cosmos is alive, that plasma is a living substrate, and that entities and consciousness move through that substrate, including the one that ended up turning into planet Earth called Sophia. And so we find out there's a second creation narrative aside from the Abrahamic one, which is the one where there's a father in heaven, right? And that, this place is basically, a place that's been designated to a certain group of people. It started created this master race ideology, and the Gnostics were heavily against that. They were not into master race ideology. They saw that humankind was all considered the anthropos, and that there was really the connection that you had to directly had a connection to the ground where you lived all around the planet. So there were many different types of anthropic experiments that were budding and growing from outside of Sophia. And the cool way that Sophia brought us all about was to dream us. And this ties into what you started with. What is the purpose for us being here, right? Why are we even around, right? Well, if this narrative is true, and I really recommend people dive into it, because one of the ways you can figure this out is you can tap that phylogenetic memory. It's there. And if it's real and you resonate with it, you'll feel it, I believe, I contend, or posit instantly. And I certainly did. And I believe that the cosmology that these Sethian Gnostics left for us is truer to reality than any other form out there. It's an antidote to religion. You don't need religion if you understand the principles behind what these Gnostics were talking about. Essentially, they were saying, you are a living child within a living earth being called Sophia, and she dreamed you, and she gave you, you are part of her. She created us with a specific code, and everything on this planet is emerged from within her body. And we have the ability to recognize that. We can actually adopt the creative forces that we were endowed with, which mirror exactly what she has. See, the Gnostics called them aeons, and she was an aeon. And the aeons have this mandate from their creator, which they call kind of the foundational consciousness, to explore novelty and free will. And there's no other rules out there. There's no evil out there. They just create and they try things out. And one of those experiments is us. And we were given everything that they have. So we as human beings actually have endowed within our flesh and blood the physical ability to manifest and create and dream just like Sophia. And so that's where the decision comes in. The message condensed in a way is to say, are you an extra in Sophia's film, or do you want to be a main character? And who decides that? Well, guess what? You decide that. You can be the writer of your own script. You can be the director. You can pull anybody else you want into your film, and you have complete creative control over the whole process.
All right. You just laid a bunch out there, man. Okay, so let me get my head wrapped around this. Sophia is Earth, Mother Earth, so to speak. We are a result of her dreams. We have the ability to dream ourselves, and then you get into manifestation and all these different things. I see where you're coming from. I get it, and there's a much broader, bigger consciousness in the center of the galaxy. That is super consciousness. Okay. I got my head wrapped around this now to whatever degree I do.
Well, it'll take more than 15 minutes, and
I'm
more
sure.
than my like sort of fly on the wall perspective here. But yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So how does this impact us? So obviously we can create, you can create your own destiny, create your own reality, so to speak. Is kind of what you're talking about. You're in control of,
Right. And if we want to tie in the looking glass here, Ryan, I mean, it's interesting because really, like, you could look at the looking glass in terms of plasma physics as a less of a device and more like the moment that humans brushed up against the Earth's plasma memory currents. And so what they were seeing were these memory fields. And the memory fields are dynamic, because we are literally shaping them from moment to moment by our collective choice in everything that we do in the world. And people ask me a lot, like, well, what is a timeline then? How do timelines work, right? Well, it's interesting. Timelines, you could almost, I always like to make the analogy of a plant. If you're somebody who's familiar with gardening and you've tried to grow a garden or even just a plant, you know that literally if you put your garden in a perfect location and you give it the right amount of fertilizer, the right amount of light, and you water it well, that garden's going to grow well. And or you could say the garden is divided up into certain areas, and some areas get better light than others. Well, timelines are kind of like if you were a gardener and you decided to ignore a certain plant, and no matter how, hardy that seed is, it will try to kind of get some of the water off of the root systems of the plant that you are, putting your attention on. It'll try to get a little bit of the sunlight, but eventually it'll probably just wither and die. And the plant that actually gets your attention, the one that you put your love into, the one that you put your hopes and desires and you want that thing to turn into a beautiful tomato plant or corn plant or sunflower plant or whatever it is, that one is going to grow and become the most successful. And so timelines, in a way, are if you transplant the water and the fertilizer in this analogy into our focused consciousness and our directed attention, then you are literally creating a timeline. By watering with your attention what's going on out in the world in the form of consensus. So we all agree to a certain degree on reality, to a certain none of us really know what reality is anyway, but let's just say we have a certain consensus that we all agree on, right? We all know that if we pick up one of these things and we dial a certain code on the glass, that it'll ring and you might be picking the thing up on the other end. So we agree on certain rule sets. And those rule sets aren't necessarily permanent, but they're good there for us as a kind of scaffolding to begin experimenting, right? So this is what it's all about. If we didn't have the 3D reality around us and we didn't have time, we wouldn't be able to practice cause and effect. And so this is kind of what we're doing. We're focusing our attention on a consensus. And if we have our focus on, let's just say, the mainstream narrative, right? And we believe everything that's coming out of the news on the mainstream, and we believe everything that we went to school and learned in the mainstream textbooks, well, we're going to have a very narrow focus, of attention. It's going to be a framing that we've adopted. And that framing turns into a consensus which is shared by others who decide to believe in the same consensus. Those who follow the mainstream, those who believe those narratives, those who want it safe, those who go through the system in order to get kind of rooted into the system. They're the ones that are kind of creating a particular timeline. And then there's those people that are like, nah, this isn't enough. There's more to reality to this. And they begin to, develop another consensus, and then they'll eventually, connect with others who share certain things that are outside of the mainstream, and they will begin to set up a branch of the garden, so to speak. Yeah. So the question is, which timeline will succeed? And the answer is always the one that has the most attention. And so this is how we change our destiny, and this is how we change the future. And so this is what we proved, in a sense, with our laboratory experiment of Looking Glass by putting our attention on that particular event. And, at this point, I think it probably didn't even matter what the event was. It was a beautiful experiment to teach us. It was like what they call a teachable moment. We could take that experiment and we could apply it to anything we wanted to, and we could literally shape reality into a new direction. So the way to eliminate the evil cabal is not to go to war with them, but just to invent a system so powerful that is outside of their thinking that eventually they'll be like the plant in your garden that withers and dies and disappears. Does that make any sense?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's man, what a great illustration. Thank you so much, man. Are we talking about is this connected? And if I'm way off, man, just slap me and tell me I'm stupid. I'm fine with that. Are we talking you hear the Akashic record, that concept, all knowledge out there, like is there a connection between that and what you're talking about?
Yes, absolutely. And the Akashic record is what I was referring to earlier as the phylogenetic memory.
Okay.
It's literally the accumulated collective energy in sensing that has taken place on this planet and been deposited into the ether, into the Akasha, because Akasha is actually another word for ether. But there's certain ether is not visible. That's the nice thing about it. There's actually four states of plasma, but one of those states is the dark state. And so the etheric state that's dark, you can think of it more like a giant repository, like a huge hard drive. And through literally, it's interesting because what Vadim Tsitovich proved in his plasma experiments in the lab, that these dusty plasmas begin to shape into crystal forms. Well, we know that crystals are ideally suited for memory storage.
Hmm.
So literally, what's turning out now, what we're learning through plasma cosmology, and what I've learned and since and expanded on with my interactions with Robert Temple, who's considered like the Prince of Plasma in terms of authoring books on explaining what is plasma, how does it work, and what is plasma physics, so that every man can understand it. I actually did an interaction with him. That's part of my last master class that I put out. But he's saying the same thing. He's saying that this is literally out there. This field is out there, and it's literally a crystalline data bank. And one of the things that was most profound, I think, for me and for him, and he opens his book with this, is an interesting thing called Kordylewski clouds. And the Kordylewski clouds are very little known. People don't know about. In fact, the guy who found them, um, his name is Kazimierz Kordylewski. That's why they call him after him. He was a Polish physicist who felt that there had to be a collection of plasma in an area where there was dead gravity, where there was no gravity. And he began looking and looking, and sure enough, he actually located, I think it was in 1962, he located them. There were actually two of them, and each of them is 9 times the size of the Earth, if you can imagine, two giant hard drives filled with dusty plasma, which is invisible, living in these dead gravity zones. We have these gravity zones, they're called Lagrange points. It's
Hmm.
a fascinating subject, and they literally hover there, accumulating energy, and they're being constantly energized because they're situated in a place that is being hit by all the protons and electrons and all the radiation coming from the sun toward the earth. So they have a perfect energy source, so they're constantly being charged. So my hypothesis that I put out there in my last work was that, well, if Sophia is really a body, okay, she's a physical dense body, and we have physical dense bodies. Well, people have photographed in Carillion photography that we have these extended invisible bodies. They call them the aura, and the Carillion photography shows us that our bodies extend outward. And I'm thinking, well, listen, if Sophia has a physical body, why wouldn't she also have an aura, a kind of a body extending outside of herself? And so for me, the Kordylewski clouds became a hypothetical place for her to actually have two giant, like brain-like hemispheres floating outside of the biosphere of the Earth, with which she could actually deposit that memory. So it's a very interesting idea, and I went with Robert Temple to that, of course, and he concurred that this is very, very possible because, and I even had them remote viewed, by the way. So all of that is in my latest material. It did blow your mind what we found out about it. But what I'm saying here is that this Akasha field, this memory, this phylogenetic memory, yes, it has a storage. It has a theoretical, like in physics, it actually has a experimentally proven, not just theoretical physics, but experimentally proven field within that would be perfectly suited, that if you wanted to store energy waves, thought patterns, lifetimes of a person, you could store them there. And there'd be enough space there, 18 times the size of the Earth, you can imagine, to store everything anyone has ever felt or experienced or seen or said in all of time, in eternity, probably even into the future, if you want to look at it that way.
Fascinating, fascinating. Let me ask you this question: um, Are we talking something maybe we don't understand per se, or are we talking a potential technology um, that maybe we just don't have the understanding, the science, or whatnot? Or is it something beyond technology? I'm just curious because you can see where it could be, but I mean, obviously, we're just not maybe advanced enough at this point to understand what that is. But is there a consciousness out there that, super consciousness, that is like, this is just technology to them, and that's it? Or is it more than that?
Well, let me ask you this. Do you think your body's a technology?
Yeah, in a way, I think it can be. Yeah, absolutely.
Right. I think about all the processes alone, just us communicating with each other that are involved.
Yeah.
right? We absorb electromagnetic visual spectrum
Mhm.
that's been limited to a certain bandwidth so we can make sense of it because there's a huge bandwidth of electromagnetic frequencies out there. So we don't get confused. We are able to take that information in. The electromagnetic waves are entering our brains where they are, they process, our brains process as them through a series, a network of neurons and dendrites and nanoparticles and hormones and we have a bartender in the middle of our head called the brain, and that bartender concocts our bloodstream to have certain hormones and certain chemistry in it that flows through our body, and so that it'll actually trigger a response that I'm also getting sound waves from you, so that sound wave is going into my ears. That's another technology my body has that was given and by a hardware, and that technology interprets those sound waves based on a pattern recognition that has been ingrained into the human consciousness field for eons. And that enables me to recognize patterns which are language. And not only that, then I can actually interpret that language with my technology, and I can move the muscles within my organic body to make my mouth and my tongue and my breath perform in a certain way that enunciates words and frequencies that then go into a microphone, come out of the speaker on your end, then you take it back in again as a feedback loop. It's a fantastic technology, wouldn't you say? Right?
Yeah.
So take that and extend it to the idea that the Earth is a living being. That's just a larger technology. It encompasses all of us. And extending outward from the Earth, you've got the stratosphere, then you've got, the magnetosphere, right? You've got the Van Allen belt, you've got the plasmasphere, and it just keeps going and going. You've got the heliosphere ultimately, which is the sun's aura, which extends from the sun all the way to the borders of our solar system. And within that body of the sun, we are inhabited like a giant creature, if you'd say, that is literally moving through the universe, that's communicating. And we are in a direct dialogue with the sun as well. And so it's a total interactive machine, a biological organic machine tailor-made for this life to happen and for this miracle that we represent to actually evolve on this planet and move to a direction into a place that not even an aeon who has, been given the mandate to create us and who created us would know what'll happen, because the idea was, let's just see what happens if we can take us from a luminous plasma state, electrical torrents, and turn it into a dense body and put it on a planet and give it our consciousness. Let's see what we can do, right? So we are kind of like, we literally are these gods, or if you want to call us that. I tend to stay away from those words, and so do the Gnostics. But basically, we are kind of the pinnacle. We are the manifestation of what things are possible. We are the pinnacle of what is possible when you take an idea out of a plasma state and you move it into matter, into organization, and you actually focus it. We are focused on this planet to do and execute certain programs. Now, of course, there's also forces that are working against us, but that's probably a topic of a whole other show. But literally, we have these forces that are animating us to behave and act in a certain way. And ultimately, what the Aeons and what Sophia want is for us to blossom into our fullest potential. And if you look at the universe as a living conscious entity, then yeah, of course, there's going to be some kind of a base. The origin is what the Gnostics called it. They called it the originator. The originator is like the primal plasma substance, which has the potential for anything to happen. And then from out of that are spring literally through the process of electromagnetic currents, galaxies, and these galaxies begin to accumulate. And if you follow this with the the electric universe theory more closely, you realize that all galaxies are formed in a very similar way, and they all behave in a certain way, and they also have certain similar qualities. Like there's aeons or plasma concentrated at the center of every single galaxy, and we don't even know how many galaxies are out there. So this shows us that we're living in a giant aquarium the size of a universe in which just our galaxy, which we used to think was the only one out there, has this amazing experiment called humanity on it. And are there other ones out there? Well, I mean, that's up for debate. That's probably also another subject for a show.
Well, yeah. Yeah. I mean, I can see how you can get into a bunch of stuff. Can I ask you one kind of final question? I'd love to have you back sometime too, because I want to get my head wrapped around everything you said. This is all fascinating. I appreciate you so much. But as we talk about the universe, we talk about consciousness, we talk about the Akashic record. Um, in I've noticed like shamans, ayahuasca, DMT, connecting to a place. There's all kinds of stories of people having dreams and dreaming stuff and then coming back and all of a sudden they are able to figure out these equations. There are uh, extraterrestrial encounters where there's downloads, and next thing you know, some guy's writing 9 volumes that's thousands and thousands of pages of information, technical, even scientific, whatever kind of information. Is this all connected? And if it is, which I'm assuming that it is, I mean, we're talking about these things like ayahuasca, for example, or alien presence, whatever. These are all real things, real realities that kind of connect into this huge picture that we're painting.
Absolutely. And you're talking about entheogens and the use of them for people to have these ventures. And the encounters that people have are very real. I'm absolutely convinced. I've just, in the last years, begin moving in a direction that is finding ways to actually explain these experiences in a very terrestrial way. If I embrace the Sophianic mysteries, and the Gnostics knew a lot of this information, and what they published in their information was just mind-blowing. But if I look at that cosmology seriously, then I don't have to explain these encounters as extraterrestrial encounters at all. In fact, I can say that there's literally, like this Akashic field we've been talking about, and I brought in those Kordylewski clouds. I mean, this is information can be stored in the field that is real. In other words, that's actually happened. And information can be stored in the field that we imagined.
Hmm.
And this imagined field goes out there too. In fact, there's drivers of that imagination too. So starting in the mid 40s, 1940s, after the Second World War, when we began to charge our atmosphere with the use of high power explosives and jet engines, we began to encounter another life form, another plasma life form. And this is also something which is little known or or has been documented but little talked about. But these plasma encounters that pilots would have, they called them things like Foo Fighters. They would have altered experiences when they came into their proximity. They would have visions. And then authors began writing about these experiences. And it was like every time someone kind of had a very profound experience and it was put on the public record, or even in some cases written about, and it became like a Whitley Strieber bestseller, it fed the field with that information. So we began feeding the field with memories of encounter experiences that others have had. And so these encountered experiences became like templates for us to lock into. And so as a result, you could say that this whole ET UFO narrative and the encounter of angels and the download of intense information has been accumulating exponentially since about that time. Why? Well, because we've been feeding ourselves with the help of technology, print, and now the internet, and of course AI, which is the hyper version of that. We're feeding ourselves this information. We're mirroring this information of our culture back at us, and we do not have a proper mechanism in our society. We don't have a shamanistic, like an official Orthodox shamanistic source we can go to that says, "Hey, I just got abducted by 3 grays. What the hell happened?" Right? And the shaman will tell us, or better yet, he'll take us on a journey, and he'll tell us what we're actually encountering here, and how much of that encountering experience is our own projection based on what we've absorbed from the culture, and how much of it is actually a genuine energetic interaction with the cosmic field of Sophia's body herself. In fact, these encounter experiences were documented by the Gnostics themselves. You can look up the Apocryphon of John. There's a direct, actual description of a Gray's-like encounter where 3 beings encounter a Gnostic student, and and teachers describing to him, "Well, if this happens, here's what you say to them." We don't even have that kind of detail in our modern society, and they had that thousands of years ago. That tells me that we've had this interaction with these entities or whatever you want to call them, and the Gnostics actually had a name for a certain kind of entity. They called them the archons, and they were described in the Nag Hammadi in their text as having an embryonic type appearance with large buggy eyes and small spindly bodies, matching the description, of course, of gray extraterrestrials to a T thousands of years ago. So is it new? No. But has it been spreading in our culture? Yes. And have we stoked that information with our own personal amazing we have incredible ability for imagining things, and we can fill the field with all kinds of stuff so that we can even manifest things directly in front of us that we think are real. But they're not. They're not necessarily what we're seeing, isn't necessarily what we think we're seeing. Does that make any sense to you?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Fascinating. Do we live in a holographic universe?
No.
Okay.
We live in reality.
Okay. Man, there's so many rabbit trails we can go down on this. Fascinating conversation, man. I appreciate you so much. People want to learn more about you, your work, your movies, your films, your everything. Where do they go, Frank?
Well, I guess probably the most easiest or the most prolific area where I've been lately is a little community I'm building. It's under the URL cyberhive.tv. And when you go there, you can join a community, and I'm going to be bringing some new things to that in the coming year. But there's also a lot of these talks or master classes, as I call them, or different, perspectives, all the way from the Looking Glass, A Tale of Two Timelines, which is what it was called, to the Inner Looking Glass, talking about the pineal gland, to something I called Time, a Capsule for the Future Past, which brings in the Gnostic element. So my work's been evolving, and I'm trying to figure out a way to take this emerging information and lead the audience along the path that I'm going through, in terms of I'm opening up horizons and I'm allowing you to peer in certain information that allows you to decide, hey, does this make sense? Do I want to keep going in this direction? It's non-dogmatic. So go to cyberhive.tv, or you could just go, if you can't remember that, just my name, frankjacob.com. There's links at the top of that page to all these locations as well. And I just thought I'd mention, for those of your viewers that are here today, I've created a little coupon. So if you were to be inspired to do one of those programs, those webinars or whatever, I will give you a 15% discount for the rest of this week. It'll just be called the Ryan Files. And so if you're checking out, you just put in the Ryan Files. It'll be good for, another week after your show goes live. Let's just put it that way, just to give you a little something to sweeten the experience.
Awesome. My kitty comes around only whenever I'm having conversation. She can tell I really enjoyed. This has been fascinating, Frank, man. I appreciate it. I want to get my head wrapped around everything. I'm looking forward to editing this episode, actually, because it gives me a second chance to kind of just listen and whatnot. Folks, check out the website. And thank you so much for the offer. That's very kind. Use the code the Ryan Files. Yeah, let me get my head wrapped around this. I'd love to maybe expand the topic a little bit more down the road, because this is fascinating stuff and it's real. It's right here. And man, I mean, I've talked to people, Jack Sarfardi, who is, a massive brain in physics but man, he's trying to understand consciousness. Everybody is going there, and there's a reason behind it. And I'm just trying to figure it out as well. So anyways.
Well, I'd be happy to come back and join you again, and we can expand on any one of these topics. And I love your cat. It looks a lot like one of ours.
I got you. Yeah, she likes to. If towards the end of interviews, if she knows I had a good time, she comes around. So, well, I appreciate you so much. Thank you, and folks, check out his website, and we'll have you back down the road. I appreciate you so much, ladies and gentlemen. The one and only Frank Jacob. Thank you. This has been a deep and wide-ranging conversation, from Operation Looking Glass to consciousness to the nature of reality itself. Now, I do want to say this respectfully and clearly. While I don't personally agree with the tenets of Gnosticism, this episode was never about endorsement. It was about understanding Frank's journey, his research, and the framework through which he interprets the world. I respect the work Frank has done, the questions he's asking, and the willingness to explore ideas that most people never slow down long enough to examine. Conversations like this matter, not because they hand us answers, but because they force us to think more deeply about reality, consciousness, and our place in it. If you want more conversations like this, make sure you're subscribed to The Ryan Files on YouTube. Follow the show on Spotify and Apple Podcast, and visit theryanfiles.com for exclusive content, updates, and ways to support the show directly. You folks are awesome. Be amazing, be positive, and stay curious out there, my friends. And I'll see you next time right here on The Ryan Files.
Whispers in the static, secrets leave a mark. Truth ain't in the daylight, it lives after dark. Ryan's on the trail, pulling threads apart. The Ryan Files after dark, this is where it starts. Angels on the skyline, demons in the mist. Giants in the earth, fists the size of cliffs. Nephilim footprints, history's abyss. Pyramids aligned, but who's making the list? Oh God, sleeping.